built out of that teenage angst.
Jonathan, nobody takes him seriously. That's a big challenge.
I couldn't agree less, really. I mean, I think that actually, I mean, his reputation hasn't declined that much. I mean, if you think of the range of 20th century philosophers who are still read, I mean, he is still probably right at the top of that. But I want to say something about his political position. I think he's remarkable because, in a way, he's a patron saint of independent writing, of the independent intellectual. I mean, he made a living from his writing, unlike most philosophers. He wrote plays and essays and treatises and polemics and novels. But more than that, he actually started an intellectual review. He started this Les Temps Modernes in 1945, Modern Times, which was to provide not just a means by which critical intellectuals could give expression to themselves. He's fantastically interesting about this. He says the responsibility of the literary intellectual is not just to tell the truth, it is to create a public. And that's a really interesting idea, to create a public that will be critical, a public, he says, that will be willing to be shocked and will be willing to be given a bad conscience. And he thought that he was indeed a Marxist, but he said Marxism is dead. Marxism has committed suicide because it has not exposed itself to a critical public. He saw it as the responsibility of intellectuals to create a critical public in which Marxism and 1,000 other flowers could
Okay, so Andrew, there we have essentially the creator of the French public sphere, a big claim for Sartre there.
And that public sphere, which was essentially, breathing in the rarefied air of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, has long since disappeared, and I actually think that's a very good and very healthy thing. And I think the reason for that is that French society has mutated and changed away from this kind of monolithic worship of the intellectual into something else. It's a multicultural, it's a multi-layered society, and, I think it's a very healthy thing that there is a disconnection, a décalage, as they say in French, between the real Parisians and the real people of the banlieue and that empty tourist space which is Saint-Germain-des-Prés, because I think it was, I'm sorry to sound so vehement about it, but I think it was and always will be seen as vehement political posturing.
Let me focus on one particular point then, Jonathan. I mean, in the present day, in the here and now, you're making the case that we should rediscover or give Sartre back a more prominent place in our understanding of modern philosophy. Put very concisely, what is the contribution philosophically that he made that we should be aware of?
His big idea was that there is no such thing as the self, if you like. There's no such thing as an inner world which we spend our lives giving out.
This is the existentialism.
This is the existentialism. We are who we are because of the way we relate to other people. We are who we are because of the future that we imagine, not of the past that we inherit. That's what his doctrine of freedom is all about. And the next aspect of that is that we are all storytellers. We live our lives by telling ourselves stories about ourselves, adventures in which we are the heroes or the victims. And Sartre's really interesting point is that we deceive ourselves by these stories. There is something built into, hardwired, if you like, into the human condition, that we deceive ourselves into thinking that we're not free to look at our lives differently than we do. And it seems to me that if Andrew wants to celebrate the arrival of a postmodern world, then I think we could see Sartre as one of the people who ushered it in, because he spoke for the workers' movement, but I think he also spoke for a new kind of politics, a politics that was about subjectivity as well as objectivity, and about the possibility that changing the world means, first of all, changing the way you understand the world and the way you live your life.
Andrew, isn't that a major contribution to the way we think about ourselves?
I'm not going to disagree with a single word of that, because that's the real Sartre that interests me, which is the Sartre after the Second World War, who's on that journey to making big political decisions, but they have their origins. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, I wouldn't even dignify it with a philosophy. It could be more interesting than that. It's an older French tradition of le moraliste, which actually connects, I think, very directly with the 18th century. But to that extent, Sartre is the leader of a generation, a very interesting generation, who crystallizes a lot of those debates. And I think that, for me, that would be his true legacy. And I'm not an anti-Sartrean by any stretch of the imagination.
You could have fooled me.
You're sounding a little bit hostile, Andrew, I have to say.
But I'm sceptical about the philosophy. I'm not a professional philosopher, but I'm sceptical about what professional philosophers might actually say about critique de la raison dialectique, the regions of Hegel by Kojève, and so on. All of that seems to be much more of a mood than genuine philosophy, if you see what I mean.
Okay, very briefly, Jonathan, let's go back to that image of 20,000 people turning up to Sartre's funeral. What does it say about our society now that it's almost impossible to imagine the death of any philosopher bringing out even 20 people to a public funeral, let alone 20,000.
Well, I mean, maybe Andrew's right about this, that it wasn't really a tremendously heartening moment. I'm not at all sure that what they were standing for. Maybe it was an idea of political protest become pure spectacle instead of a means of changing the world. But I still think it's true that Sartre wrote some of the most atrocious prose in the world, and he also wrote some of the greatest prose in the world. And I think if we go back and read La Nausée or even Lettres et Néant, it's a very, very difficult book. If we read his little autobiography, which is called Words, or you read some of his plays, we will discover that he is one of the greatest writers in the world.
Well, I'm a great fan still actually of Les Mains Sales, the thriller in which there's a sort of fantastic shooting scene at the end, which probably shows my vulgarism when it comes to Sartre. But many thanks to Jonathan Ray and Andrew Hussey.